Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Pontiac Wraith, the auto attorney. Now, today we're not doing a case of a very bad automotive take. We're doing a little video I wanted to do for younger or beginner enthusiasts. But before that, I wanted to introduce you to my personal car, my little project. So this here is my 1970 Chevrolet Nomad. Her name, as you can see on the side here, is Normandy. Now, if you're a Mass Effect fan, you'll know exactly why, because of the SSV Normandy in the original trilogy of games. So, she is very different from a standard Nomad. So, I mean, if you couldn't tell by the side X exhaust inspired by the Shelby Cobra and Dodge Viper, and my wing mirrors inspired by sports cars of the late 60s and 70s, in particular Datsuns, plus the bull bar, which is actually not a standard Chevy Nomad bull bar, that was a completely custom affair, and, well, the wood interior, plus my little Tantalus drive core, aka my engine. So let me show you what's lurking under here. That there, if you zoom in a bit, it's a Ford SX V6, and this thing is stupidly powerful. I need to dyno it, but last time I dynoed it, before it got all these upgrades, it was making about 350 horsepower. So yeah, she's on Instagram as Normandy_70 Chevy. So if you want to give her a follow and see some more antics with this car, go take a look. What did I mean by doing a video for beginner or younger enthusiasts? Well, I'm doing a two-parter in this, so two separate videos on the best sort of cars you can get as a beginner or younger enthusiast. So I'm splitting it into two videos because, one, top 10s are usually a bit better in the YouTube algorithm, so yes, maybe I'm just doing it for that, but also I don't want to bore you too much with some of the nitty-gritty and that. So, and on top of that as well, I let people vote on these on the Instagram on Instagram polls on the my Nomad's Instagram page, which, shameless plug, you can follow it. The link for that page will be in the description below. So yeah, so let's get started, shall we? Alright, so at number 10, we have, because I'm a big muscle car apologist, even if they're not nowhere near as popular in South Africa, maybe not very advisable here as a beginner or younger enthusiast car, but I wanted to throw one on. We have the 4th gen Camaro, in particular the Z28 with the 5.7 litre LS1 V8. So, the 4th gen Camaro is kind of the black sheep of the Camaro generations. There's in the US, and even I use this sometimes, they call it the catfish. And you will see some pictures throughout this video of it, with a bit of commentary on it. Because yes, it's absolutely ugly. Now the 90s was a bit of a weird time, in a sense, for American muscle. You had the SN95 Mustang, and the Catfish Camaro, and also the WS6 Pontiac Firebird, that tried to be a bit more aerodynamic, that sort of curvy, aerodynamic 90s shape that in some ways the import seed, the JDM seed, kind of popularized in the 90s. And to an extent it didn't really result in some very pretty cars. I still think the WSX Firebird is actually a very good looking car. The SN95 Mustang, not really my cup of tea. I think the New Age looks a lot better, and the Fox body before it as well looks a bit better. And then the 4th gen Camaro, the Catfish, oh god. Whatever drugs GM was on when they designed that, I would love to know. Because it's probably the most visually challenging of the Camaros in terms of its looks. So, So, but what makes it so good is the powertrain. You don't buy a 4th gen Camaro really for the looks. You buy it for the LS1. And maybe this is also my bias, because I am a bit of a GM person. I do believe that the LS platform is probably the greatest V8 ever made. Whether you're talking American, Euro, or JDM V8s. It is so good. And that's because there is so much you can do to them in terms of power. They take to boost hilariously well. It's kind of stupid as well how much power you can get out of an LS1. I've heard of people doing 1,000, 1,500 horsepower out of LSs. But then again, I'm going to put an asterisk there, because that takes a lot of money, a lot of parts, and a lot of time to achieve, and even then you're probably going to risk blowing something up. But at the same time, I find the tuning potential of the LS is probably what would draw me to the 4th gen Camaro. So, in South Africa, they are the cheapest by far of all the Camaros. I think also in the States at this point as well. I think also in the States. I could be wrong in the States though. You can pick them up for between 90,000 to 200,000 Rand. That's what I've seen mostly on Facebook Marketplace. But be warned with a Camaro here, in particular the ones with the 5.7 V8. Fuel consumption, you're gonna cry. You're gonna cry if you do not have the money for it. It will basically stand more than it drives if you don't have the money to actually fill it up. The other thing is, it probably won't be as cheap as some of the other cars on this list to modify, or I won't say maintain, because LSs are fairly they can be cheap to maintain, but modification parts, aftermarket parts, will be hilariously expensive here in South Africa, because it's the LS. The only real car that we got with the LS here was the Chevrolet Lumina SS, and those cars are now quite expensive now, which is why I just excluded it from this list. I might have put it on a few years ago when they were around the same price as the 4th gen Camaro, but the way they're skyrocketing in value is, and it's probably because that was kind of our muscle car before the S550 Mustang came here. I can kind of understand it. It's kind of a icon now in its own right, even if it is technically a rebadged Holden Commodore. But yeah, I'm going to put up the results for the poll that was run on the Nomad's Facebook page for it. It was a split, 50-50 split. That should tell you it was a bit polarizing in a sense. Now at number 9 we have something German. And in South Africa we prize German cars quite a lot. VWs and BMWs and Mercedes are absolutely big here. But I wanted to try something a bit different. In fact, so we've had the 90s Camaro. Let's go back to about the 80s with the Porsche 924. Why the 924? Well, in some ways it developed a reputation as being the poor man's Porsche. And I think that was a bit unfair, because it's a brilliant driver's car. Yes, the engine is kind of shared with VW. In a sense, a lot of the parts are shared with VW. And yes, it definitely was one of the slower Porsches of its time. But it is it is very good at handling, and it's a great way to learn how to drive a rear-wheel drive car. Now, what would if this happened a few years ago, I would have put an E30 BMW here. But those are now appreciating quite a lot. They've actually exceeded the 924 in terms of value now, which is crazy to me. And 924s as well are starting to creep up in value. I've seen prices for anywhere from 60,000 all the way to like 200,000, maybe even a little bit more for very well sorted ones. 94 turbos are a bit more expensive because they're a bit more desirable. But for me, there is an asterisk. What I've praised the 924 a bit, but here's the thing: it's still a Porsche, so it will still be if something breaks, it's going to be very expensive to repair if you use the original Porsche parts. And also, old Porsches, they can, if they do have a bit of a tendency to be garage queens in a sense, because often they might break something and then it takes you a while to get parts and that. So that's why it's at number 9. The only reason it's higher than the 4th gen Camaro is because I think in some ways it's might be a wiser choice here. Maybe not the wisest choice, but a wiser choice than a 4th gen Camaro here in South Africa at least. Now, I'm going to put up the poll results for you as well. It was also, same as the Camaro, it was a 50-50 split, which I kind of understand, to be honest. I knew it would be a bit polarizing. On the one hand, you will have those enthusiasts who would love to have one, young enthusiasts who would love to have one, and on the other hand, I think a lot of the other 50% were probably people who are a bit wiser and have a bit more experience with, you know, enthusiast cars, project cars, etc., etc., etc. Now, at number 8, and I had to throw some sort of bucky on, because South Africans love their buckies. In the US and other parts of the world, you would probably call them pickup trucks. In Australia, for some reason, they call them utes. So, the two biggest ones here are the Ford Ranger and the Toyota Hilux. I did not use either of those because, for some unknown reason, they maintain their value very, very well. And I think part of that is because they're very dependable workhorses. They are super reliable. I mean, Top Gear back in the day tried killing a Hilux by like leaving it in the sea, letting it be washed out to sea, and then they tried dropping it from a building, and it just wouldn't die. It kept starting somehow. So I can kind of understand that. And Rangers are no slouches either in terms of how tough they are. So I was looking around for something, and I decided to look at the Mitsubishi Triton. So they haven't held their value as well as those. You can find them for under 200,000, sometimes even under 100,000. And they are quite dependable as well. Maybe not to the extent of the Ranger and the Hilux. And I think they were criminally underrated, in a sense, compared to the Ranger and Hilux when they first released. I'm talking about the gen from about 2007 to around 2015, if I remember correctly. Then there was a new generation from 2016, I think. Now, there are some caveats, I think, to the Triton. Because they didn't sell as well as the Hilux and the Ranger, I think parts might be a bit more difficult to come by. Also, in terms of aftermarket, if you want to put some, bigger tires and, some off-road goodies on it, you may not have the selection of the Ranger and the Hilux. So that's something to take into consideration. And I think the other thing you should take into account with the Triton is if I know Mitsubishi have also sort of pushing the CVT transmission, and around the same time they're sort of selling the Triton. I believe they did have a Triton with the CVT. Avoid a CVT at all costs. CVTs are ridiculously expensive. They don't shift very well, and also, if I'm being honest, you're better off with an automatic than a CVT. CVTs are not all they're cracked up to be. I'm going to put up the poll results now for the Triton. Again, it was a 50-50 split. And I think that's because, while I wouldn't recommend a big bucky build to, say, a younger enthusiast. I think the Triton might be a good beginner bucky for someone who's just dipping their toes into the off-road world and doesn't have the money to buy a Ranger or a Hilux, in my view at least. So yeah, I can kind of understand the 50-50 split in that regard. Right, now we move on to number 7, and something a bit more my speed, because I love classic cars. And while I am a big American car guy, British cars are like my second favourite love. And for number 7, I wanted to put the classic original Mini Cooper from 1963, that was produced from like 1963 to as recently as the late 90s. What makes them so good? Why? I think they are one of the quintessential classic car projects. They are very easy to work on. They are small. They're small, yet for some reason they're a lot bigger on the inside than they look from the outside. Plus, they are actually quite fun to drive. I mean, they were used in rallies and were surprisingly competitive with much more powerful and bigger cars, which, now that should tell you what they are. Why was it number 7? Well, I think it's all, you'll struggle, while parts will be cheap, it might be difficult to find them. In fact, I think the biggest Achilles heel you'll have is tires. Tires and wheels, if something goes wrong there. The classic Mini uses very, very small wheels and tires, standard. So you will probably struggle in that regard. You might even have to import from the UK, which will be quite expensive. Also, classic Minis, if you've ever seen one try to go on the highway, it's hilarious. It's hilarious if you're the one watching it, but if you're the owner, it can be a bit terrifying, especially if a giant truck goes past you. But I think that's part of the charm of the Mini. It's just got so much personality to it, compared to a lot of modern cars even, and a lot of classics as well. And for the poll results, I was a bit surprised at the poll results. Well, the poll results were 2/3 yes and 1/3 no. And that was a bit of a shock to me. But at the same time, maybe I could understand it as well. Classic cars, you're either going to get a really well-sorted example, or you're going to end up with an absolute jalopy. So, yeah, I can kind of understand where the what happened in the poll results. So, I would still highly recommend a Classic Mini. They are awesome cars, honestly. Right, for number 6, another car that's a bit more my speed, and that's the Mark II Ford Escort, in particular the 1600 Sport. Kind of have a personal connection to this car, in a way. My mother's very first car, when she turned 18 and got her license, was a Ford Escort 1600 Sport. And I would have said a Mark I Escort as well, but the Mark Is are kind of appreciating. They're starting to go sky high. Mark II Escorts are also starting to go up, but not to the extent of the Mark Is. So what makes the Escort so good? Again, it's kind of the same as the Mini. They're a bit more. They're very easy to work on, and that 1600 Kent motor is very, very reliable. You'd be surprised. I've heard of people going thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of kilometers on the original 1600 Kent before needing to replace it. So, and also, again, it's also a very fun car to drive, which is reflected in the fact that the Escort had a very successful rally career in the 70s. The 80s is kinda as well. I do think Lancia and Audi then became the dominant rally force in the 80s, but Ford in the 70s were quite dominant as well in rally. Now, also parts here would be fairly common, because Escorts sold like bloody hotcakes here in South Africa. Parts will be very common, very cheap, and very obtainable. What is the downside of the Escort? Because of the age of the car, and this is something you'll encounter with a lot of classics. Rust. escorts in particular can be very susceptible to rust. If you find one that's rusted very badly to the point where it started eating away at the chassis, don't even bother. It's going to cost you a fortune to actually get that car right. And that is basically why that's the only real thing I'd say about the Escort that could be bad. That could be quite bad. So let's take a look at the poll results. So on the poll, we got 70% yes and 30% no. So I think it was a lot more popular than the Mini, and I guess it's because in some ways there's a bit more love here for the Escort, which I actually kind of understand. And that's because in some ways also the Escort is a bit of a local legend here as well. People love them a lot. In fact, my Nomad is powered by another South African another local Ford Legends engine, which is the SXV6, which was using things like the Cortina. So, yeah, I mean, I kind of understand the love for the Escort here. So I'm going to put the poll results up, but let's move on to number 5. So number 5, I literally put on as nothing more than a wildcard entry. Here, for no reason other than I was vaguely interested to see how it would do. And some people are going to laugh, but I kind of also, I was genuinely surprised, but after doing a bit more research, I kind of understand why it ended up there. And that's the Lada Niva Sidekick. So, backstory about the Lada Niva. They were produced in the Soviet Union from about the late 70s, so about 1977 I think was the first year of production. And the car, they went relatively unchanged until 2017, when they finally got fuel injection. And even then, that generation from 1977 lasted until about 2022, when Lada finally announced a new gen Niva, which I think is just, I think it's just quite funny. And yes, you can get your Russian and Soviet jokes out of the way at this point. But I did some research on the Niva as well, and in some ways it's become a bit of a guilty pleasure of mine. Yes, it's powered by a little 1.7 litre engine, but it had 4-wheel drive standard, and it was designed to cope with, well, what can only be described as horrendous Soviet road conditions. So they are surprisingly capable off-road. I saw a video on YouTube a while back of one of these Nivas keeping up with a Land Cruiser on one hell of a tough off-road course. Now, let's talk about positives about the Niva, and this is why I think it might actually be the ideal starting point for a beginner enthusiast who wants to do some sort of like off-road build. They are cheap. Very, very cheap. I've seen prices from 15,000 Rand all the way to 70,000. So, I think in some ways you could beat on a Lada Niva more than you could with, say, the Mitsubishi Triton that was on this list. That's because, and I think it's because they're so cheap. But also, there's also, kind of like some of the other cars I mentioned on this list, the Escort and the Mini in particular, very easy to work on because, well, it's incredibly simple. Very, very simple. Very, very basic little off-roader. Now, downsides of the Lada Niva. Parts. Especially mechanical parts. So, in South Africa, we got the Sidekick was sort of our version. I was actually told a story by a friend of mine about the Lada Niva Sidekick. And the Sidekick was built here, was a version of the Niva that was sold here, but they only ever sold about 700 of them, from what she could tell me. She told me this from a friend of hers who's actually a big Lada enthusiast, which I kind of don't know was a thing. In fact, I've seen a lot of Niva Sidekicks here that have had complete engine swaps to engines that are, have more parts available here. So, if you want to do that, then you negate that downside. But if you wanted to keep it all original, then you might struggle if something breaks, which could be quite rare because apparently they are tougher. They are quite tough from some of the stuff I've seen and from what I've heard. But that is a bit of a downside. So in the polls, and this was what shocked me, 3/4 yes and 1/4 no. I was shocked at that result. I honestly thought it was gonna do poorly because, you know, Lard is a bit of a joke. Kind of like the Yugo or the Trabant. But yeah, I mean, did frickin' well in the polls. So I'm gonna put up the poll results for you now, and it's time to move on to number 4. Right, number 4, and this is another guilty pleasure of mine, maybe, because, I mean, as you saw with my Nomad, I just like a big brick. And that is the Volvo 850, in particular the wagon variant. I love the look of a station wagon. There's something awesome about a station wagon. I can't quite describe it, but especially the Volvo wagons, they are just, in some ways, I think the Volvo 850, despite looking like a brick, is aged very well. I think it's a very timeless design, in a sense. And if you get the 850R variant, they can be absolute sleepers. I've heard stories of these things dominating much more powerful, much newer cars, if modified correctly. Now, and as well, and that kind of makes sense, the Volvo 850 actually has some racing pedigree, kind of like the Mini did, the Mini on this list, and the Ford Escort does. In the 90s, when the Volvo 850 was being sold, they were used in touring car racing, and they gave things like the M3 and the 190E of the time a bit of a run for their money on the track. I don't know if they were as successful. I need to look up a bit more, look a bit deeper into that. But yeah, I'm shocked. I've seen the videos of these Volvos going around track, and it's quite funny that a giant brick could defy the laws of physics as much as the Volvo 850 wagon could in touring car racing. So let's get to the positives of the Volvo 850. Volvos are very, very reliable. In some ways, they are the tanks of Sweden. When they very rarely break down. And also they are, I think in terms of practicality, this might be the one you would go for on this list. Mitsubishi Triton, I mean, it's a bakkie or / pickup, maybe slightly more practical, but I think for practicality in terms of what you could use for hauling stuff, like hauling stuff or carrying dogs in the back, the 850 makes a lot of sense. Second big positive, they are quite cheap. Actually, they are very, very cheap. I've seen the prices for some reason hover between 30,000 and 50,000 for Volvo 850s, which is kind of weird for me because the equivalent BMW wagon and Mercedes wagon at the time are a lot more, sometimes even double the value of Volvo 850s. So you can pick up one fairly cheap. Yes, they don't really have the same aftermarket as the potential as BMWs and Mercedes here. But there's just something cool about a Volvo wagon, slammed on air suspension, nice rims, a big banging sound system that appeals to me. So, yeah, the downside I'd say is the limited aftermarket compared to its contemporaries. And also, while Volvos are very reliable, if something breaks, it could be a bit expensive to repair, depending on what breaks. So, but the fact is, I think that would be a very rare occurrence, unless you ended up with one that was so badly maintained by the previous owner that it was basically a ticking time bomb. But yeah, and as for the poll results for the 850, it got 80% yes and 20% no, which I was kind of happy about, because, I must say, I just like seeing the support that giant bricks on wheels get. Now we just got to move on to number 3. So my JDM boys have probably been wondering where a Japanese car is going to go on this list. Watch for part 2, there will be another one on there, but I wanted to throw this one on, because 1, it's a bit my speed because I like classics, and 2, it's actually one of the best looking Japanese cars ever designed, in my opinion. And that is old Datsuns from the 70s. In particular, I wanted to focus on the 120Y. Beautiful car. I think it's one of the best looking JDM cars ever made. Maybe even one of the best looking cars ever made. And they are very good little coupes. If you want to, and also kind of like a few of the classics on this list, very easy to work on. And here in South Africa, there are parts galore for them. And the aftermarket for 70s Datsuns is also quite big. Yeah, maybe it would probably be bigger than maybe a bit bigger than, say, the Minis and the Escorts, if not on the same side, on the same sort of scale. And also, I've heard of people engine swapping 120Ys, and apparently they're quite good for that, depending on what sort of swap you do. Now, here's so the upsides as well. I've seen that 120Ys fairly cheap. They are appreciating in value. In fact, a lot of 70s Datsuns are starting to appreciate in value, but for now they're quite cheap. So if you're a beginner enthusiast, pick one up. I mean, go ahead and do it now if you really want to. And also, as I said, very, very simple to work on. Downsides. It's a 70s car, and they didn't have the biggest and most powerful engines at the time, so you might be a bit disappointed with the performance, but that's what the aftermarket is for. And again, rust. They are also quite susceptible to rust. And again, same with the Escort. If the Datsun's chassis starts rotting away because of the rust, just not worth it. Just not worth it. You are gonna pay a lot more than what you pay for the car trying to repair the chassis if it's rusted, and sheet metal on the body if that's also badly rusted. Now, where did it do in the polls? It got 83% yes and 70% no, which I think is quite cool. I honestly do believe they are awesome little cars. So, yeah, I'm going to move on to number 2 for you guys now. So number 2 for my Mercedes fans. This is also another car put on kind of as a compromise for the E30 BMW and, to an extent, the E36 BMW 3 Series. So E30s are skyrocketing in value because of how popular they are for things like spinning and drifting here. And the E36s as well are starting to go that direction. But if you want a German sports sedan that can do that, why not look at the Mercedes 190E? And I wasn't the biggest real fan of the 190E, but I will say this: after looking into it a bit more, I actually think it's so criminally underrated compared to the E33 series and E36. You can get them a lot cheaper now than those two, and yes, maybe the aftermarket isn't as good as big as those, but if you want to do spinning, and you just want to upset the status quo of E30 M3s, which we here call Gusheshes, bring a 190E. I think that would make my day to see one of those there. So, positives. It's cheap. They're very, very cheap. And in terms of a platform, I also think they would make a good platform to learn how to drive a rear-wheel drive car, in my opinion. And also, there is one issue that I'll go into the negatives, that is the exception to this. Old Mercs from this time period, for the most part, mechanically, are reliable. And that brings us to the negative. Electrically. Oh boy. Mercedes love to overcomplicate things electrically. There is and because of that, when Mercedes from this era, and even to an extent later Mercedes, saw having electrical issues, oh boy. Basically, one thing will fail, then another thing will fail, and then another, and then another, and then another, and then another, and eventually it's just going to brick your electrical system, meaning you'll probably have to do a complete rewire of the entire car, which is not cheap. And also, I don't know, I think it was this Mercedes generation that Mercedes tried or was it a later generation that Mercedes tried using biodegradable wiring, which is a bit counterintuitive because the wiring would just break down and the car would be bricked. That's the downside, because electrical issues on Mercedes are very expensive to fix, because Mercedes are probably the kings of over-engineering their cars, of the German manufacturers. So that would be the biggest downside to me, because if your car's electrics go, then you won't be able to start it unless you constantly kickstart the thing or have jumper cables and a spare battery on hand. Yeah, now we move on to number one, and before that, I just want to say where my project, my 1970 Chevrolet Nomad, would fit into this list. So I'll do that for you, and then we'll move on to the number one. Quick little edit here. I forgot to mention the 190E's poll performance. So the 190E got 89% yes and 11% no, which I kind of expected it to do quite positively, but nowhere near that extent. So I'm just going to put the poll results up now for you, and then yeah, we're going to cut to what I would say about my Nomad, if I would recommend it to a beginner or younger enthusiast, and then yeah, we'll do the number one. So where does the Nomad fit into this? The Chevy Nomad. So I would not recommend this for this particular car for a beginner. And here's why. So as much positives as there are about the Nomad, they are ridiculously tough. They will survive almost anything. Like this one was in a very sorry state when I got it, but look at it now. And I mean, it died once before. Look at it now. It's alive and it hasn't really died since. And maybe this is just because I've modified it so heavily. In terms of reliability, it's only really had 2 major mechanical faults in the 10 months I've had it. So the very first one was the brakes went at about August, about August, which was not fun. And quite recently, actually, I've got a very bad engine misfire, and also there's a bit of an oil leak, so that's something I've got to sort out. So why wouldn't I recommend? So those are kind of the upsides. Downsides of Nomads, and these are the 2 biggest ones. Parts availability. Nomads are rare. They only made 4,000 Nomads between 1970 and 1980, and by my calculations, of those 4,000, less than 1,000 are left running on the roads. This is one of those examples. So parts are very, very rare to come by. They can be cheap, the parts, because they share quite a lot of parts with contemporary Chevys at the time that were sold in bigger numbers, like the Forenza and the Commando, but you might struggle still with parts for this car. So, and then the second thing is, because of the parts availability as well, sometimes you have to do a lot of custom work yourself. So, for example, this entire dashboard is completely custom, because these have very terrible dashes. They were very basic, and 2, not a lot of original parts could be found for this car. The only real original part left in this particular Nomad is the speedometer, which is from VDO. And yeah, so you have to also maybe get used to some custom fabrication in that with a Nomad. Now, the other biggest problem with these cars is the ones you'll find. The vast majority of the ones that I've seen on sale so far have been bodies and rolling chassis. So unless you're looking to throw a lot of money at, putting a whole new engine, a lot of other missing parts and that into this car, I wouldn't recommend it. But if you do find a good, well-sorted example, maybe. But even then, I put a big asterisk on the Nomad because as much as I love them, in particular this one, I wouldn't really recommend it for beginner or younger enthusiasts. Number one, I believe, it's not only the best classic car project you could probably do, and probably one of the best project cars you could do. I think it is the quintessential project car, and that is a classic VW Beetle. It is one of, I believe, the all-time greats in terms of cars. I've got a few friends who drive Beetles, and they absolutely adore them. And I can kind of understand why. The design is so timeless. It's so timeless. And there is so much you can do with a Beetle compared to a lot of other cars. You can either, do that sort of hippie style, or you could do a Baja Bug, or some sort of beach buggy, or slam it on air. With the Beetle, in terms of a classic car project, or quite a lot of car projects, your imagination is your only limit in terms of what you want to do. And for me personally, I think the Beetle it's another car that I'd say is one of the prettiest cars ever made. The design has aged so well that in many ways I believe the Beetle is a timeless design. Now, let's talk about positives with the Beetle. They made tons of the things. Over 20 million, if I remember correctly. And that means parts are everywhere for these things. Also, aftermarket. You can get so many different parts for them. And so many different parts, whether it's period correct stuff, like maybe a roof rack that will fit on it, period correct wheels, or even a bit of stuff that you can do to the engine in the back. And even then, if you want to go full engine swap or even crazier with mods, there have been so many done that it doesn't matter what you want to do. There's probably someone who's done it before that can give you some sort of advice. And another thing, the Beetles are fairly reliable if you look after them. They will run forever. If you look, as I said, asterisks, if you look after them. Downsides of Beetles. I think the biggest downside maybe for the Beetle is, again, rust, because it's a classic. I think the other downside can be, is that prices vary wildly with Beetles. You can find, unfinished projects or shells for next to nothing, and then fully restored, pristine examples could be well over 100,000 rand. So prices are all over the place. That is kind of a thing as well, with the prices being all over the place. Sometimes people take chances with Beetles. So you're playing kind of Russian roulette when you start looking at higher price ranges. You might end up with a very well sorted example, or someone who cut a lot of corners and then it constantly breaks down on you. But even so, I think the Beetle is the quintessential project car. A quintessential beginner car. In my opinion, it is also probably the most iconic project car ever. Oh, quick little edit as well that I'm just putting in here before I do the whole sign-off thing. The Beetle got 88% yes and 12% no. So yes, the Mercedes 190e did get more positive votes, but by like 1%. But so I kind of had to use my intuition a bit with that, with regards to placing that and the Beetle. I think the biggest problem with the 190e is the electrical issues, which was why it dropped to second place. But yeah, let's cut to, and yeah, that's the end of the video. You can like, comment, and subscribe. I am going to be posting a bit more frequently because I am moving next week, actually. And I'll have a bit more of a nicer space and a bit more time to record stuff once I've finished my move. So anyway, this is Pontiac Wraith, the auto attorney, and I'll see you guys a bit later.